Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the delay. My name is Jens Alm. I'm from Play the Game, Danish Institute for Sports Studies. The first speaker this afternoon is Catherine Ordway from Trobe University. She's a professor of sport management. Welcome up to the stage.
Hi. Thank you very much for having me. I have to put a special shout out to one of my students from the University of Canberra. Actually, I teach across 4 universities, and my top student, John Young, should have been here in my place, but unfortunately he's quite ill and wasn't able to travel, so I, in the kindness of my heart, offered to be here instead. So you have me. I'm presenting for an anti-corruption forum in Moscow this week, and so I'm presenting it with you first, which is kind of fun, because I am chairing the session, so I don't actually get to speak in Moscow, so it's cool to cover some of this material with you today. I wrote the paper with Nikos Passas, who's an anti-corruption academic, and I've made the paper available to Play the Game, so you can look at it in more detail. My background is that I'm a sports lawyer, and I've worked in anti-doping for almost 20 years, and it's become increasingly obvious that we don't have enough tools in our toolbox to deal with integrity issues in sport, and we have to start looking at other solutions. This conference is a fantastic opportunity to share some of those ideas from around the world, and my paper is a small suggestion in part of the bigger picture. I don't suggest that it's a magic bullet or a big red button that's going to solve all the problems. I think that we need a lot of different tools in our toolbox to solve the different integrity issues. Anti-doping fits within the broad spectrum of corruption and cheating, and we've talked a lot about match fixing and other forms of cheating in sport, and so I think that the ways that we solve them are similar. Whether we're dealing with corruption issues or we're dealing with match fixing or bribery or fraud of any kind, doping, then cheating to win, cheating to lose, there are similar tools that we can use, and I'm going to suggest today that one of the tools that we haven't used effectively yet, and we haven't yet exploited to its fullest capacity, is the international conventions and the international legislation which is already in place. So what I wanted to talk about today is the United Nations conventions that have been mentioned a little bit already this week about anti-corruption and the transnational organised crime conventions. We've talked too during this conference about whether or not we should have an independent integrity body, similar setup to WADA. At the moment, the reality is we don't have that, so what else can we do? What we do have is these conventions which, to my knowledge, have not yet been applied to the sports setting. And I think that there's an opportunity here for us to have them apply to sport. Because as you can see, we have a number of state parties that are already signatories to the conventions. And so let's tap into that and get them to start thinking about applying what is already in place into the sports setting. So you can see there the UNCAC, as it's known, has 177 state parties who are signatories, so countries around the world, some of whom are represented through people in this room, and 185 for the UNTOC. So that's a lot of countries that are already on board who should be implementing this legislation in the national setting. Next week in St. Petersburg, the UNCAC meeting for the Conference of State Parties is getting together so that the 177 people can explain how they are implementing the convention, and part of that, I think some pressure should be put on those nations to say, well, okay, that legislation is in place, so let's now start applying it to things that we're seeing happening in the sports industry that we otherwise don't have capacity to do anything about. Last night that we got to hear already from the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime in Sport about a strategy for major events. So for those of you who weren't here for the presentation, I'll just make you aware that that's in place. But I wanted to skip over that and just look at this convention and compare it with what we already have in the sports setting. We've heard people talk about the UNESCO Anti-Doping Convention, and you can see there we've got a lot of signatories in place, 182, which is great that those countries are on board and are supposed to be implementing that convention in an anti-doping setting. Match fixing, we don't have an international convention, and there's been already a number of presentations talking about the opportunity from the Council of Europe side, but there's only 21 member states at the moment, so that's quite small, and what we need to do is try to tap into something that's already in place that involves a larger number of states. So, under the UNTOC, I will look at primarily, as there are a number of different offences that the signatory parties are required to apply, and I think that it doesn't take too much imagination to see that this legislation, if applied nationally, could then be used in a sports setting. And some examples immediately come to mind, don't they? We've been talking about them all week. There are situations where it's perhaps bribery of an event. It might be to do with broadcast deals. It may involve different athletes that are cheating through doping or otherwise. And perhaps it doesn't immediately come to your mind that what we're dealing with is an organised criminal group and corruption in the traditional sense, from a corporate sense, but I think it doesn't take too much to see that we are actually talking about the same thing. An organised criminal group, you can see the definition here in the UNTOC, is defined as a structured group of 3 or more persons that existed for a period of time. They act in concert and they aim to commit serious crimes. So serious crimes has a definition. I'm suggesting through my photographs that perhaps the US postal team could be considered an organised criminal group. They travelled around the world, they received plenty of money. In some jurisdictions, doping is a serious crime because it attracts, I will give you the definition, crimes punishable for jail terms of more than 4 years. In some jurisdictions we have that for doping, but we don't need to be necessarily talking about sport crimes. We can be talking about crimes under here where it's fraud, for example, or bribery or embezzlement or money laundering, which some of those things people in the sports setting have certainly been accused of, including our friends up there in the recent arrests, whether it's through the Swiss prosecutions or the US prosecutions. A number of the allegations relate to the traditional kind of corruption crimes that you would have seen in a corporate setting. So the serious crimes in Australia and in a number of other jurisdictions, we have jail terms for match fixing that are already in place in our legislation. In Australia, some of the other people have already explained in their forums that we have a 10-year jail term maximum. I heard today that Turkey also has legislation in place for, I think it's 15 years maximum jail terms, and I gather there are a number of other jurisdictions where that's the case also. But what's really fun about this, when you've got a large number of parties that have become signatories to a document like the UNTOC, is that you have things like the Mutual Legal Assistance Clause, where it's a requirement of the state parties that they help each other out. So rather than in the Balco case, which Marion Jones is there for those who don't recognise those extraordinary good ab muscles, the USADA, the United States Anti-Doping Agency, really was feeling like it was acting alone. But my suggestion is if they were acting in concert with other people, because there were a number of different athletes that were getting benefit from the Balco laboratory for the types of substances that they were using to dope. And they didn't just come from America, there were UK athletes and other athletes who were involved here. If they'd worked in concert with other countries, they might have been able to get a response much earlier under this kind of legislation. As it turned out, Marion Jones only really ended up coming to the fore because one of the other athletes gave a syringe into the UCLA laboratory and it was analysed to find out what it is that they were using. She still denied and had maybe 150 different tests in her life and said, well, I'm still clean, nobody can prove anything against me, and ultimately her life came unstuck because of fraud in relation to checks that she was trying to pass off and lying to the police. So that's really why she went to jail. It wasn't really a doping case. But I think that if they had used these mutual legal assistance clauses, then we may have had more success at an earlier time. The same situation occurs also with the UNCAC. I just put up the world map so that you get a kind of impression of where all these signatories are, and the world is quite well covered by the people who have signed up to purportedly put these anti-corruption pieces of legislation in place and to work against corruption. And you can see that these offences that it's mandatory under this convention to have implemented in the domestic setting are equally applicable in the sports setting. So what we've seen with these FIFA cases, most recently the allegations relate to bribery of public or foreign officials and arguably officials of international organisations. It's possible that we could think that FIFA fits into that definition. It hasn't been tested, but maybe that's the case. If there was a situation where there was a suggestion that the World Anti-Doping Agency was bribed somebody from the World Anti-Doping Agency, then that would fall into it. There was an allegation that was made that Lance Armstrong had tried to bribe members of the International Cycling Federation. The recent Öztürk report, the International Cycling Federation independent report, has found that that wasn't in fact the case. But if those facts had been proven, then that's the kind of case that you would be able to bring under this. Money laundering, again, those allegations have been made about the FIFA executive. Embezzlement, misappropriation, other diversions of public property, obstruction of justice. There's no reason why we couldn't be using this legislation in the sports setting, and I wonder why we haven't. I wondered if perhaps it was, somebody said in one of the other sessions that it's about sport being treated as an exception. And that's why we don't include it in this way. What happens on the field stays on the field, that kind of mentality. And perhaps that's why we haven't been using this legislation in this way. But it's time to have a mind shift, I think, and say, is this a tool that we can use? Yes, there are lots of other tools out there and lots of different levers, but maybe this is one that we haven't used and we could use more effectively.
Please stay for questions. Yes. Do we have any questions in the room? Okay.
I'm off the hook.
Yeah. The mic.
Sorry, Jens. Thank you so much for that presentation and I think the concrete suggestions. Is there a precedent, another model that you could point to of, not another sports federation, but another organization that's non-traditional within the frameworks of these conventions and how they've applied?
My life is solely in the sports world, so I haven't seen it applied in other settings, but I'd be very happy to hear from other people if you've seen it used. I was wondering about maybe the mining setting or something like that. Certainly they've used it there. Agriculture, definitely also. But other people, have you had experience? I know that there are some people who have worked very closely with the convention in other settings. I'm not sure if they're in the room though. One to take on notice, as the politicians would say.
Other questions? No? We save it for the... oh! Sorry, can you just wait for the mic? It's coming.
Did I see that New Zealand hadn't signed that anti-corruption
Yeah, I noticed
Convention?
that too. So I will have to go and check that to see whether the map is old or whether they, in fact, are not signatories. I also noticed that about our nearest neighbours, so I'll have to chip them.
Do you think they should just give Australia a bye in the Rugby World Cup final on that basis? They can't be trusted, obviously.
Well, there is some suggestion that we should just make them a state of Australia, so perhaps we'll do that and then it's much easier.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Welcome.
The next speaker is Jonas Burgheim. He's the CEO and founder of Sport Cares. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. Welcome, Jonas. Forward, backwards, pointer as well.
It works. Okay. That was the biggest fear. And my voice a little bit, but that'll be fine. So after that presentation, I think I don't really have to stress the intersections between public and sports world so much anymore, because they were basically at the core what was already presented. I am here, as you heard, as the founder and director of Sport Cares and Politicares, a consultancy project, and the Sport Cares arm is basically doing consultancy in sport policy, and the Politicares arm in political affairs. If we go into the brain of this a little bit, this is basically the broad idea behind the consultancy work that we do. Consultancy activity mainly in the fields of humanity, sustainability and human rights, in this case connected to sport in the sports cares context. The services that we provide are in policy analysis and strategic advice, and then in strategy development in the different fields of good governance, sustainability, CSR, and the like. One focus has become really the partnership and facilitation management in this, and that again is one of our, that's why I'm saying it, one of our main projects, the Sport Cares for Humanity Forum, where we aim to bring together a stakeholdership on a level playing field to exactly look at these themes and to connect that, of course, with our services and put in the insight that we have in that field. That is for a short background of what we aim for. What I'm doing in this presentation is I'm basically taking you on a little flight over, a little sightseeing tour over policy developments and human rights developments in the field of sport. Before I did this, I was a policy officer in the UN Office on Sport for Development and Peace, and that being said, I just wanted to point it to, because it's a regional or at least national relevance here. There was a work I did with the Sport Cares arm, was a policy review for the Danish government in research funding, but that was only to mention. And then I'm taking you on this mentioned flight. Before I did this, I was at the UN, you can see, where it was based in Geneva. And what we did there, was on the one hand sport for development and peace work, and my focus area was the policy affair, or the policy side of this context. Policy, that is quite a big word, and often quite an abstract word as well. I went this way, and of course policy is, the content that flows from politics in the polity context, but it also, and that I found very interesting because it was a theme that ran through this conference here already in a way as well. There are of course different definitions of policy. Some actors may see it in one way, some actors may see it in another. Some actors may see it in one definition that Merriam-Webster is offering, that is that it's the management or procedure based primarily on material interests, and others may see it as a high-level overall plan embracing the general goals and acceptable procedures, especially of a governmental body. That can differentiate, of course. I'm looking now here solely at the UN policy developments in more recent time and in the sports context. Bit of a selective overview. There is a string of General Assembly resolutions on sport and in particular sport for development. There are two main rows or two main areas where this can be noted. One is, or two streaks of that really. One is the Olympic truce resolution set, and one is the resolution set on sport as a means to promote education, health, development and peace. They occur changing in biannually. And the Olympic truce, that's why they are looking so happy right there, was just adopted again this Monday in the General Assembly in New York. You may wonder actually why and how there is such a closeness and cooperation with the Olympics and the IOC in this setting, as you can see here, Thomas Bach with Ban Ki-moon. The Olympic truce goes back to the ancient Greece, but was revived in 1993, and that relationship has evolved quite a bit thereafter. So nowadays, as this is actually the only complete resolution I'm showing you today, nowadays, as of 2009, the IOC is an observer, a permanent observer organization in the United Nations General Assembly, where you can see that it's quite a closeness because there are not too many of these observers. And if you look at them from a legal or policy point of view, the International Olympic Committee sticks out a bit in terms of the specific area of societal issues that they address with their activities. The other string of resolutions, as I mentioned, is the sport as a means to promote education, health, development, and peace. That's, of course, the very positive side of what sport can contribute, what sport can do in the development context. It's in hypothesis, of course, that this, is such a big help. It's really difficult to prove, but it's an important work that's being done. In this resolution, though, there was in the very recent, or the last one, not the very recent, it was last year in October. In the last one, there was a paragraph which read, supports the independence and autonomy of sport, as well as the mission of the International Olympic Committee in leading the Olympic movement. And that's by the General Assembly. Now there you can see that the field of sport is no longer, let's say, only the very positive tool to do work in the field of development and peace for the UN, but it's also becoming more and more politicized, and this is a clear trace of this here, and it's also a start of a development which is very interesting to follow, I find, but it's that the interest by member states in this and the critical discussions about this are increasing quite heavily these days. Other important fields I would like to point to, which are also General Assembly resolutions, are the United Nations Millennium Declaration, where sport was mentioned in the outcome document, and now the new set of UN goals, the outcome document for the Sustainable Development Agenda, where sport again is mentioned as an enabler. The Sustainable Development Goals, you may have heard of them, it was the ambition of some of the actors involved in the sport settings to actually include sport as one of the targets, at least. So there are 17 goals now. You can see them here, and they're are 169 targets, if I'm not mistaken. And it was the goal to include sport in those, which is just from my estimation not really suitable. But what happened again, as in the Millennium Declaration, was that sport was included as an enabler. Quite interesting to see in this context. As I also mentioned, the autonomy issues and the like, is in which position this was put. It's basically explaining the agenda here, and then the last paragraph is also, I think, at least interesting to note in this context. We reaffirm in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations the need to respect the territorial integrity and political independence of states. And sometimes that's a tricky affair to maintain this and do policy work in other fields at the same time. In the Human Rights Council, there are also some developments. Most recent one is that there's a report now for the first time, really a report on the specific theme of sport as an activator or to promote human rights for all. You can see the Olympic ideas also figuring as an aspect of this here. But one very interesting aspect of this, and also a development which is noteworthy, is that it is marked here, which sometimes, as we heard in the last presentation as well, is maybe not so clear, that as with any other human activity, sport is governed by human rights. The core human rights instruments therefore apply to sport like all other fields of human activity. So from the legal point of view, you could argue you don't need to have specific legislation on many aspects in sport or so, but you have a set of rights and legislation that already apply and are in place. So those are interesting developments, also showing in a joint statement that this is getting more concretely debated, and that also the mega events and their specific role are being of more and more relevance and concern. Just pointing to this, because it's another relevant policy development, is the International Charter of Physical Education, Physical Activity and Sport. The UNESCO Charter, it used to be of physical education and sport, and is now in a final draft for the General Conference to take on, I think, early to mid-November, and the next session is going to be on this afternoon, on the progress in that field. Some observations to come to an end. Sport policy is picking up speed, for sure. It's debated more critically. There's a closeness between public actors and the sports actors, but there are certainly also differing policy understandings and interests, as I hinted to with the definition. Sport can be a tool for attaining development and policy purposes. The question is maybe if sport really is an enabler of for sustainability, or if there doesn't need to be sustainability aspect covered in sport more, maybe. Also the same question to human rights, if sport is really an enabler or if it also causes infractions, which it certainly does. And then last but not least, I think one thing that could be a good, for me, is also a result from this conference, is that a clearer differentiation between the business and the social value in sport is necessary for coherent policy relating to sport. And as this was only a short overview, further reading, maybe if you're interested, this article that I've co-authored and which is coming out as an XP Routledge publication, I think at the end of this year, early next year, Walk the Talk and Policy Aspects in the EU and UN. That's my little flight for you. If you're interested in any more direct exchange, please be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonas. Do we have any questions? None? Yeah. Catherine?
Hi, thank you, Jonas. Catherine Ordway, obviously, Trobe University. I just wanted to ask you a question. Rather than sport just being an enabler for human rights, hasn't it also been recognised as a human right in itself?
That's also a bit debated, I would say. I mean, it is one position and one interpretation, let's put it that way, that it is a human right itself. Access to sport is considered a fundamental right in the UNESCO Charter. And that's where this idea stems from originally, that sport itself is a human right. As said, I mean, there's both positions, I would say. There has been in the more general addressing of this matter, there has recently, I think, been a development towards saying sport is a human right. But from a human rights law perspective, I would say that is not, at least not quite precise.
Do we have some more questions? Okay, we save some questions for the debate as well. Thank you very much, Jonas. Yeah. Oh, sorry. The next speaker is Professor Peter Donnelly from the University of Toronto.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's important to remember that sport is one of the very few remaining areas of human activity that is segregated. And that segregation in this era of human rights is only justifiable on the basis that men and women are separate but equal in sport. And clearly that's not the case. We've been carrying out a series of gender audits that were triggered initially by the IOC triumphalism and media triumphalism around the London Olympics. Some media outlets called them the Women's Olympics, and there was a great deal to be pleased about. There was a higher proportion of women in London than at any previous Summer Olympics. There were women in every sport for the first time with the addition of women's boxing, and there was no country that deliberately excluded women from its Olympic team for the first time. But we suspected that this wasn't the end of history for women's equality, and that there are still reams of research showing that they're nowhere near equal in terms of funding and sponsorship, publicity and media representation, in leadership, in sex testing, and for our purposes in terms of participation and opportunities to win a medal at Olympic Games. This has been an IOC commitment since 1994, since the Paris Congress of the IOC, where deliberately became part of Olympic policy to move towards gender equality, and you can see their statements there. So the gender audits, we thought we'd just go back to basic. What's left to do to achieve gender equality at the Olympics? And we've analysed all of the men's and women's events and sports at London 2012 and Sochi 2014 with the purpose of identifying gender differences in the structure and the rules of the sports and events and the opportunities for men and women. And what do these gender differences tell us? I mean, they send important messages if, about what segregation is and how important sport is. So if we look at growth in women's participation on events, and events are opportunities to win a medal, the proportion of women as participants has increased from 1976, that's over the last 40 years, from approximately 20% 1 in 5 athletes was a woman in Montreal and in Innsbruck. And it's up to 40% now, which is two out of 5 athletes are women. The proportion of medal events has also increased by approximately those same proportions, from 1 in 5 to 2 in 5. But what's important to recognize is the growth did not occur as a consequence of the 1994 policy on the IOC's part, where when we looked at 1994, women were about 30% of the Olympic athletes in 1994. And so there'd been an increase of 10% between 1976 and 1994, and since 1994, in the 20 years since 1994, it's only gone up another 10%. So, I mean, maybe it's plateauing a little here. So, 20 years after the Paris Congress, almost 60% of the athletes at the Winter Olympics are men, and over 55% of the athletes at the Summer Games are still men, and I don't think that's a credible situation in the second decade of the 21st century. So how do we account for the failure to achieve equality? I think there are 3 overlapping reasons that account for it, and I'll go through each of those individually. The way that women's events have been added to the Olympics since 1994 has been primarily on an equality basis. So sports such as mountain biking, beach volleyball, curling, and snowboarding were added for both men and women. You could not add a new sport unless you added it for men and women. So that didn't do anything towards increasing equality because of the adding both events for men and women. Some events were added to match traditional men-only events, like ski jumping, ice hockey, pole vault, have been added to the Olympics. But often after significant lobbying, and in the case of ski jumping, certainly after a lawsuit against the IOC, which the IOC lost, but realized that this wasn't going to go away. So despite the fact that there are 2 women-only sports at the Summer Olympics, rhythmic gymnastics and synchronized swimming, there are still 30 more events for men than for women at the Summer Olympics, opportunity to win a medal. And at the Winter Olympics, because of some mixed gender events and the way we count events, there's still 7.5 more events for men than for women at the Winter Olympics. Quotas, sports stipulating a lower, many sports are equal in terms of their representation of men and women. Basketball, volleyball, quite a few equal sports, but there's a lower quota for women in a number of sports. In football, there are 16 men's teams and 12 women's teams in the Olympic football tournament. In water polo and ice hockey, there are 12 men's teams and 8 women's teams. And in the case of ice hockey, there's even a larger quota for the number of athletes that each country may bring. So there are 25 men and only 21 women may be on a country's ice hockey team. Some quotas are related to the number of events. So the boxing quota, there are 10 men's events and 3 women's events in boxing. So there's kind of a relationship there. It's not a complete one by any means, but it is there. And some seem much less rational. So you can see that rowing is almost double the number of men rowers than women rowers. In luge, 78 men, 28 women. The quotas are set by the international federations, and they're approved by the IOC in a formal process that precedes every Olympic Games. So they're both complicit in this, and the quotas make it very difficult to gain in equality, and also the number of events, the greater number of events for men also block it. So why can't we move forward with this? Well, gigantism is the IOC's claim in this. Since Barcelona, there have been approximately 10,500 athletes at each Summer Olympics. So gigantism is not caused by the athletes, but athletes' gender equality suffers because of concerns about gigantism. And where does the gigantism come from? It comes from the huge number of media that attend at least every Summer Olympics, and the figure there is for London. And it also comes from the huge growth in the number of accredited persons at every Games. And so it's gone up from 196,000 in Sydney, and then 14 years later, it was 510,000 approximately in London. Those are the people with credentials at those Games. So that huge exponential growth in accredited persons, we argue that an organization that has allowed that kind of growth to occur cannot block its own policies towards achieving gender equality by keeping by not adding more places for women athletes. So what does Agenda 2020 say in this case? There's a specific recommendation about gender equality. We like to think that Thomas Bach and picked this up from our London report, where we recommended this precise first goal, that be going to at least towards 50-50. And there's a quote there justifying what they've been doing. But in light of Recommendation 9, which caps the number of athletes and events, 50% women's participation may only be achieved by cutting men's sports and events, and that's begun to happen already. So men gave up one boxing weight class in order to add 3 women's weight classes. And so that, we feel, is completely the wrong way to go about this. That athletes should not be the ones to suffer, particularly male athletes, to increase gender equality by this artificial cap of 10,500 and a similar cap on the Winter Olympics. So inclusion of more mixed gender events won't add women athletes, according to our Sochi data. So when we looked at Sochi, 3 new mixed gender events were added to the 2 that already existed in figure skating. The biathlon mixed relay, 2 men, 1 woman, the luge mixed relay, which was 3 men and 1 woman, and the figure skating team competition, 3 men and 3 women. When we actually did a count to see how many net new athletes were added as a result of this, it was 4 athletes, 2 men and 2 women across the 3 new events, which totaled 168 athletes. So the 168 athletes already had competed in the singles events, and only 4 additional ones were there to compete in these events. So the mixed gender events didn't contribute to increasing gender equality at Sochi, and it's difficult to see how they could. If you're going to add events that are 50% men and 50% women, or in the case of luge, somewhat different, then how can that, okay. How can that come about? Well, we think that may come about because of the way the IOC does mathematics. So if you look at the bottom line here, the IOC counts 49 women's events. And so out of a total of 98 events, that means that women are in 50% of the events. Well, that wasn't the case at all. Women were in 45 events and men were just over 52 events. And what the IOC has done here, it's added the 3 new women mixed gender events only to the women's side of the chart. And so they've made it look equal when it clearly is not. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Do you have any questions? Okay, I have a question. When will it be a 50-50 event?
When will it be?
Yeah.
Well, it won't be 50-50 until probably they lift the cap on the number of athletes that can be there, or I mean, if they start cutting more men's events, I think there will be a huge backlash. So, I mean, it will really necessitate increasing that cap to generate equality.
So the solution is just to increase the number of athletes, just a cap of the athletes.
The only fair solution is, I think, if you start cutting men's events, you're cutting for people who've been in training for a long time, you know, and I mean, their rights are violated as well. So it's not by any means a fair way to go about this. I think.
Yep.
Thank you. Is it working now? Okay. So this is Hande Öztürk. I'm a lawyer. I just got a question. I think I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. So when we're talking about the quota that's put on women's sports and women's participation in IOC events, can it be also viewed as an egalitarian thing to do because there's, for instance, less demand to ice hockey or box, these sports that are traditionally considered as men's sports? So there are less women, and percentage-wise, they're equally represented at IOC because there are less women that are active in boxing compared to men. So you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I think it's a chicken and egg question. You know, if you create the events, you will get more women participating, and countries will not fund women athletes if there's not an Olympic event or not a possibility that their team will go. So I don't think it's a good bit of devil's advocacy, but thanks.
Good afternoon, International Sambo Federation. Michal, I have one question. Maybe it's people is going to hate me because I'm going to ask questions which is pretty much regarding the gender equity in the sports on the other side. But do you think that it's really important for some sports to become equal in gender for men and women? Because there are some sports which physically are not able to do it for a woman. And I'm sorry for that, but I mean, I don't want to see my wife or my girlfriend to fight in a cage of the UFC. This is something maybe too much.
I don't think you have a friendly audience in this room, but I don't think the kind of equality we're calling for doesn't mean that it has to be exactly the same number of men and women in each event. It means that if there are men's events, that there be women's events of one kind or another. So it doesn't really matter, but you know, in this day and age, you shouldn't still have 55 or 60% of an Olympic Games being composed of men when the majority sex is underrepresented.
Yeah, Catherine.
Sorry, thank you very much for that presentation. That was really terrific to see it laid out like that so clearly. I wondered if you'd had an opportunity to look at the criteria that the International Olympic Committee looks at for the events and the disciplines staying in the Olympic program to see whether that criteria was relevant. Because I know that they are looking at things like the broadcast appeal of a particular event. They're looking at the depth of the competition, the number of countries that are contributing to the pool of athletes that are involved with a particular discipline. And some of the men's events actually don't stack up anymore. They're no longer popular, and young people are not playing them. So the fact that they have a very long tradition is no longer reason perhaps to keep them in the Olympic program, and yet a number of the international federations stay with them. I was on the board for the Australian Canoeing Federation, and canoeing has a similar issue with the number of medals available to men and to women, and there was a big push from the Australian side to try to get more slalom canoe medals, for example, because we have the number 1 and number 3 athletes in the world, so it's a self-interested gender equity argument, and I just wondered whether you'd had an opportunity to look at that criteria also. Yeah, not as in-depth as that. One of the criteria that you didn't mention is that a sport be played by both men and women. That's another reason for inclusion now. You know, I could list 6 or 7 Olympic sports immediately that I'd like to drop. You know,
give me one.
One?
Yeah, one.
Modern pentathlon, shooting, you know, and that makes enemies as well. And clearly the politics of this is incredible. And when you look what wrestling went through just recently, the fight is really hard to change the Olympic program, and the fight to get on the Olympic program is equally hard. But just to go back to that, if there were more women-only events, that would be another way of adding to it. But I think the IOC hasn't looked at that. Yeah.
Do we have some more questions for Peter? Yeah. 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 2 more questions.
Hello, my name is Anis. Actually, I just want to have a rebuttal for the gentleman there. One is, when it comes to a matter of sport and decision of who's going to play, I don't think a board full of men can make a decision of letting a woman play or not. If there's a association of women, if the women want to play the sport, then so be it, whatever it is. And going back to the comment of UFC, whether it's men or women, frankly, if putting 2 men in a cage and basically beating each other until they're concussion and they become totally dumb, then I'm sorry, I mean, even I, as a future father, I would not let any of my sons or brothers or uncles going to play those type of sports. And further, I think if sports, the ultimate goal of sport is to basically develop a society, I think having more women active in the sports as professional will actually make it's the mothers that basically choose whether their kids will go and do sports. So that will actually bring them and educate them and tell them how important it is to be active. So I'm sorry, I would actually say the same thing is, in a boardroom, I would say that 90% of the men that are in a boardroom shouldn't even be there. So if we want to use the argument...
Yeah, we have to move on. Hande, first, and the last question is down the room.
I just wanted to ask one more question. I know it doesn't really fall within the scope of your presentation, but I still want to hear your opinion on that. So in addition to the medals that are available for women, what are we going to do about like inequality in payment? I know we can't do really anything to force clubs to pay more to women, and also because women's sports attract less interest and ergo they have less money. But for instance, for big tournaments like Grand Slam tournaments, like even in Wimbledon, the male winner wins more than as an award money. The prize is bigger than that's awarded to the woman. Well, it used to be.
Yeah, it used to be, not anymore.
It used to be. That's so. I was just trying to say for this tournaments at least, like not like clubs paying their employees, but even for this kind of tournaments, like what do you think? What do you think should be done in order to secure equal treatment women financially? Sports professionals.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to answer that, but at the beginning I listed 5 major areas of inequality that still exist, and one of them is funding and sponsorship. Another one is media representation and publicity. Probably one of the most prominent ones these days is the huge absence in terms of leadership in sports organizations and in coaching. And then the whole sex testing issue. So I think what I was talking about today is just a 5th area of inequality, and you know, so we need to fight all of those battles at the same time. Thank you.
The last question, Peter, is just one more. This is the last question, I promise.
Good evening. I couldn't agree more with the comment that my previous speaker did about the equality of the payment and how to secure this. But I wanted to see it from another perspective, the gender equality. We are speaking about females and the rights of females to participate. But how about if we see to the separate disciplines of the sports, not in total participation? There are some specific disciplines only for females. And, for example, synchronized swimming. And I don't want to see my son doing that. So What about that?
Why not?
In the case that we are seeing that from the, let's say, from the side of a man.
I think I did mention that, and I think, you know, if women-only sports want to be added, that's fine. But there is now men's synchro and men's rhythmic gymnastics, which can only be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. The next speaker is Hande Öztürk, attorney, and she's going to talk about the women's involvement in sport as a cure for match fixing and corruption.
Let me just set my alarm so I don't talk too much. Oh, you have it? Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. This is Hande. So I foremost would like to apologize for my voice because I've been under the weather for a few days now, and the Danish weather certainly did not help, unfortunately. So my topic would be about women's involvement as a cure to corruption in sports. It might, as a topic, it might sound like I know what I'm talking about, but it's actually not conclusive. I just wanted to throw in some ideas in your minds so that maybe it might lead up to a further discussion where some of you might offer concrete solutions, because honestly, I've never thought of the issue before from a societal perspective. I've always been a big supporter of women's involvement in sports, and I've been doing sports since a little kid, and then I worked at the mega events like London Olympics, for instance, and FIBA World Championships. I worked with the International Softball Association and the European Softball Association. So I've been in the field for a while, and I always saw the positive effect on a woman's life when that woman is actively involved in a sport. And ergo, that was enough for me to be a big supporter. But I never thought about the positive impact on the society if there are more women involved in sports than there are now. So I come across with certain studies that suggest that women's involvement in a given field might actually lead to less corrupt business. Of course, none of these studies are conclusive enough for us to draw a certain conclusion and say, yes, women are the fairer sex. There are certain authors who think that women are the fairer sex. There are certain authors who think women are not fairer sex, although their participation, their involvement in a certain field decreases the corrupt business. It's not due to them being more ethical than men, it's due to other factors. So I just thought that we talk about these factors just to have an idea of the issue, because as I said, none of these studies are conclusive enough for us to be certain of the root causes of corruption and whether women can be a tool also in this way. I hate to associate the word tool and women, but in this specific subject, if it can be a tool to also diminish the corruption in sports, and I thought it was like a little too important to ignore all the suggestions. That's why I picked up this topic. So, as I said, certain says women are now ethical, women are more ethical than men, and certain says women are not more ethical than men. They just don't have enough access to corrupt business, or they don't have the power, they don't have the money to be engaged, or they are not positioned in the higher levels as opposed to men. I don't think it matters in the end, whatever the reason that women seem more fair than men. I think in the end they all draw our attention to the same thing, that once women are involved, they're going to be less likely a corrupt business in a given field. So why not try it? They might not be bringing up a concrete positive impact on sports, but I see there is nothing wrong about getting more women involved. So there's no downside. There might be not an upside once this is practiced widely, but certainly I don't see any downside. So I don't see any problem with trying this policy and trying to get more women involved, not only for the sake of those individuals, but also for the society and the sports sector itself. So I'd like to give examples of a couple of thoughts on that. But before then, I'd like to mention a few studies. So there were this study, a field study made in Peru, in Lima. So the study was done in 2012, and it was about the perception of bribery in among traffic police. And then the majority of the public believed that the corruption in traffic police was a big issue 14 years ago. And then in 2012, the perception of corrupt business of traffic police in Peruvian, according to Peruvians, had decreased compared to the 12 years ago. So what happened in between? Like, what happened in these 12 years? Well, the thing is, Peruvian police employed 2,500 more women. And actually, this was not only resorted by Peruvian police, but the same practice has also been tried out in other South American countries. And they also, in Mexico, for instance, they started to employ by 2010, I think it was also about 2011, 2012, they started to employ more women in as a police officer, because first, the public had a perception that women would be less susceptible to be corrupt and ergo take bribes. Maybe the woman wouldn't be, but if the public believed, I think it was a good enough reason to employ that policy, because then people would not feel so comfortable offering bribes to the officials. Maybe that was the reason that the corruptive business had decreased. But in any way, these are the countries, these are the certain practices that have been tried out, and it seems to be working. We don't know, I can't say the exact reason, but it seems to be working. So why not try the same for sports? Of course, there's also a study about the corruptiveness in politics, and that was conducted by Iris Center, University of Maryland. And the result of the study is that corruption is less severe where women comprise a larger share of parliamentary seats. And there's also another study, and this was also published by Transparency International. And there are other studies that are in conform with this particular study, that especially in the political field, if there are more women involved, those countries would be less likely to be engaging in politically corrupt business. But the thing about that, maybe there are the people who conducted this additional study, and I'm going to give the names. So Shanda Jha and Sudipta Sarangi, I probably mispronounced the names, but I apologize for my mispronunciation. So they said, in politics, yes, it works. But not because that the women are less corrupt. It's because women are less likely to get to the higher positions in societies which are more democratic and more open to and more transparent, and which value ethical conducts more than less advanced societies. So, because these countries care more about being ethical, obviously there will be less corrupt business, and in correlation with them, there are going to be more women in power, but that doesn't mean that the woman being in power results in those societies being less corrupt. So that's also something else to consider. In any case, some studies also shown that women politicians, when they're in power, they're more likely to care about the society's well-being than the individuals itself. Of course, that draws attention to them being more ethical, but also it might be something to consider, like women are considered to be more altruist, but not because they want to seem to be more ethical and doing the right thing, but because in corrupt societies, they're going to be more likely to be affected in a negative way. Because in corrupt societies, there are going to be less payment for the women, and there are not going to be enough money spent on the education and the healthcare system, blah, blah, blah. So ergo, it's going to be the woman first who's going to be affected. Their payment's going to be cut. There's going to be deprived of access to health care and sanitary issues. So since the women are the ones who are affected most in a negative way in in corrupt societies, it makes more sense for them to take care of themselves, want to take care of themselves once they're in power, and want to establish a system that works for everybody, including especially less privileged people, mostly women, in any country you go in the world. Even in the well-advanced societies, it's usually women or transsexuals, those who do not have the traditional power like in a traditional society. So that might be also the reason, but whatever the reason is, once women are in power as policymakers, they care more about like giving more money to education, spending more money on education and healthcare system, blah, 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 which on the long run effectively affects the society being more democratic and well advanced and also caring about more equality. So that might be another chicken and egg situation that we just talked about. There comes another study that was conducted in Republic of Georgia. This is about enterprise owners and managers. So according to this study, the companies that were owned or managed by females were less likely to pay bribes. 5% of those agreed to pay bribes when they had the chance. So this might indicate that women are not acting more ethical than men just because they don't have access to connections, but there are also other factors that come into play, because 5% of those women, like out of 100% of those women were in a position where they could pay bribes. Only 5% accepted, whereas 11% of men accepted to pay bribes. So that might also indicate something else that we should be thinking about. However, if we're gonna look into the sports specifically, I'd like to say it might work for some reasons. And here are my reasons. They're coming from my personal experience and background. Well, if we're going to talk about the sports administrators, female administrators, most of them have to pay a bigger cost than their male companions. If we're going to be a sports organization administrator or a referee, I'm a basketball referee currently. I've been working for 7 years now. In order to be treated equally as a man, I have to be better than a man. And I know with my first mistake, I'm going to be the first one to be sent out. So men are usually more tolerated in a field that's dominated by men. So I guess we have more to lose. That means we would be more scared to do something wrong that could risk our seats. Whereas for men, they access it more easily than me, they paid less cost, and when it comes down to that, they have little to worry about and they have much little to lose than me. So I think that's why it might be also useful. But when it comes to the match fixing in female teams and female leagues, one can say that it doesn't happen as frequent as men's, because, first of all, it doesn't attract as much attention as the men's leagues do. So it doesn't mean that the female players are not interested in match fixing. And some other counterparty can argue that if the money is the basic motivation for people to agree to match fixing, then female players, female athletes will be the great target, because they're usually less paid, which what we just pointed out in a few minutes ago. They're usually less paid than male athletes, so they have, if the money is the issue here, they would have a bigger motivation to get involved in match fixing. But of course, betting systems, women's leagues do not distribute as much money as the men's leagues, so the award might also be small. So that might be something that's putting them behind. Still, we know that there are match fixing going on in female leagues. And another reason to do that in female leagues could also be because there are less supervision on women's leagues. Everybody, like men's leagues are under the spotlight and everybody is watching and monitoring it. But what about women's leagues? So if you're establishing a good gambling system, and if you want to do that through female athletes, it might be also very beneficial. And so we might be also thinking about these counterpoints. And I could not go even more because my time is up, but I'd like to have any questions that you have and further discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can stay on the stage, please.
Hi, I just had one quick question. Andy Brown from the Sports Integrity Initiative. Have any specific studies been done on match fixing in women's sport? Because I'm not aware of any, to be honest.
I'm not aware of any either. I tried to look into that, but there's no real specific studies about correlation between match fixing and women. There are just corruption and women studies. So I figured if you included more women in sports business, that could also like help us, combat match fixing and corruption. But we know that match fixing is not only practiced in among male athletes, but also women. The reason that the coaches and the administrators, like federation administrators that are caught of match fixing, are all men, because usually they're all men. So we don't know if women are there, they're going to do it or not, but I think it's worth trying anyway.
Yeah, what
Thank you. It's James Seeley from the Australian Sports Commission. Thanks for your presentation. Look, strongly support your view and your position in regards to females being involved. And I'm not sure if you're aware, in Australia, in our mandatory governance principles, we talk about females representation on board. So strongly support where you're coming from. I'm interested in your view, I guess, in expanding it further in terms of diversity in general. So diversity in age, skills, qualifications. And if you've done any research or insights into broader diversity and how that affects broader diversity in terms of those decision makers and how that affects match fixing and corruption.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point of view. I personally never done a study on diversity and whether the more diverse the sports environment is, the less corrupt the sports environment would be. But I think it might be also good policy to adopt, because if we're more diverse, then it might be very interesting to say that, but we might be less likely to cooperate with each other on certain issues that might be like very, very scandalous in so many countries. So if we're all on the same page, maybe for corruption and match fixing, it's going to be easier for us to, find our way around it. But if we're coming from different backgrounds, I think everybody's going to have at least this idea in the mind: what is she going to think? What is he going to think? Because, he's British, he is Dutch, and he's Indian, he's Muslim, he's atheist. So I think it might work that way too, but, I guess it would require another study on that.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Jens Sevel. I'm a law professor at the university up here. I teach international sports law, among other topics. Don't you think it's a risk saying that women may have a gene that is less corrupt than men? I mean, if we look into the future and say, okay, it's good to have a lot of women in, and I agree with that, but due to equality, not due to any other advantage, don't you think we will say we go from red alert, we're knowing a lot of corruption now, to green alert, not knowing what the business is? I mean, there may be a lot of corruption out there, even though that women are in governance.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, actually. And that's why I can't agree with the studies that indicate that women are more ethical than men, because I do not believe that women are born naturally more ethical. I think it's a matter of societal concept. Maybe women are more afraid to be looked down at, or maybe the women really do not have access to the corrupt networks. So I think it's a real risk to say that women are more ethical and men are awful people. So let's just put more women, even if they do not have the qualifications for that. I just think that if we include more women, at least, until we reach the equal positions, we do not have anything to lose, but we might have something to gain, especially because I know where I'm coming from. As a sports professional, a female sports professional, you have a lot to lose. You are not allowed to make mistakes. You are not allowed to repeat the mistake. The first mistake, you're out. That was my experience. So I would not be able to risk what I have for match fixing. And for men, of course, like they have a lot to lose too, but I think it might be, paying them more money might be a bigger incitement. Or like we talked about it with Catherine, the prostitutes, offering them prostitutes and hooking them up. So offering prostitutes to a female would not really serve the purpose. I mean, obviously you can offer her something else that could substitute prostitutes, but it would still cut the prostitution there. And so there are like various factors that can, help us in the process.
Oh, Kasper in the back.
Hi, hello. I'm Kasper from the NOC of Denmark. I was wondering if you could argue that the same could be, if your argument actually is the same in doping problems. Do you know? Could you elaborate?
Yeah, that was one of the discussions I had with a friend of mine before I came here, because if match fixing is a shame, the shame of the sports world, doping is definitely another one. And as much as we know, there are so many female athletes who do doping, and there's so many female doping scandals. So we can't really say that females are more ethical based on that argument. But I think there's a differentiation to be made between match fixing and doping, and it's my personal opinion is that I've known many athletes, and some of them were even sanctioned for doping. And when I talked to them, none of them was ashamed of doping, because athletes generally do not believe that doping is a bad thing. And most of the athletes think all athletes do doping. Therefore, they're not doing anything wrong. They're just stupid enough to get caught or unlucky enough to get caught. And one of the athletes who get caught and he was a New Zealander basketball player, he had told me they knew I had cannabis. Because I was just coming back from my best friend's birthday party. They didn't want me to be playing for a while. They've been, dealing with me for a while. So they just, in order to cut me, punish me, they were following me and monitoring me very closely, and they did it on purpose. But there are other players, they didn't care. So the athletes don't have the consciousness that doping is a bad thing or an unfair competition. They believe that everybody is doing it, so they just are trying to not to get caught. So that's why I think if we look at it that way, females and males, athletes that are doing doping, they don't really think it's such a bad thing. That's why I think it's a little different discussion there.
Thank you. We have to move on. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Urszula Starakiewicz. She's a PhD and lecturer from the University of Warsaw. And she's going to talk about the transparency of Polish Sports Federation from a journalist perspective.
That's right. How does it work? There is no presentation yet. Oh yeah. How does it work? All right. Okay, so my name is Urszula Starakiewicz, and I come from Warsaw University, from Poland. And I guess we will change the subject now completely to the local. You might think that it's a very local thing, because I'm going to talk about the transparency of the Polish Sports Federation seen from the journalist perspective. However, I don't think it's that much local, because maybe after this presentation you might have some ideas why, looking at the list of participants of this kind of conference, you will see only people from Western Europe and from States and from Australia and from other countries like that. So I guess I don't have to talk why the transparency in the national federations is a very important topic. The whole conference is about that. But I would like to say a few words why, from the journalist perspective, why I wanted to research this topic from the journalist perspective. So, sorry. So, first of all, the journalists of course have this watchdog function, or they can have this watchdog function. But what I saw in Poland is that there are not many articles in Polish press and in Polish media about mismanagement in national sports federations, even though from my research and from talking to people, I know that there is a lot of mismanagement, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of problems in national sports federations. So I thought, why is that? I wanted to ask this question. So I did the research, the qualitative research. I come from university, so my background is a little bit different than than many people here, but I did qualitative research talking to journalists from main media in Poland. And my main research questions were: how transparent are the Polish sport federations from the journalist perspective, and what aspects are more and less transparent, and did the transparency change over time, and what kind of information would the journalist like to get to call a particular sport federation transparent? So when I did this research, I thought that actually I might have changed the subject of the presentation, and I did change it a little bit, because everyday operations of the Polish sports federations doesn't seem to be that interesting subject for the journalists when I talked to them, and they gave me a few reasons for that. First of all, the journalist told me that it's dull, it's not interesting. I got an answer that was quite shocking for me from the journalist who is 30 years in our media, and he's attending all the Olympic Games, and he's writing in our newspapers, important newspapers. He said, "What interesting can they be in a Polish Olympic Committee?" I was like, good question. And the second thing they say is that it's difficult to research and to write about national federations, because to write about it, you have to have some level of knowledge about associations as such, and how they are financed, and how the people are elected. My interviewers told me that I would be really surprised on how low level of knowledge of this kind of things is in the group of Polish journalists. So there is not enough knowledge. So during the press conferences, not the right questions are asked, because if you don't know what to ask, then you will not get the proper information. But they say that also it's not the biggest interest to look at the sports federations, because general publicity is not interested in this kind of articles. If you look at the indicators, that's what they said. If you look at the indicators on the clicks, what is read, those articles are not read. The articles about the FIFA crisis that we are talking here on this conference mainly about that, it's not such a big interest in Poland. So if people are not interested, why journalists should write about that? And it's, of course, the last reason is easy. It's presumed to be risky. We were talking about that yesterday during the journalist session, that if someone is a journalist and working for just writing about Polish football, he is not really interested to ask questions to the president of the federations, because he might not get the proper information or the timely information afterwards. So, if no one wants to read about that, why risk this? So, of course, there are some situations when the interest of the general public and the journalist rises, and it's in two kind of situations. First, when there is a big corruption scandal, like we just had last year in Polish Volleyball Federation, when the president of the federation and the vice president got arrested for the corruption during organization of the World Championship in volleyball. So then we had some articles about that, but surprisingly, on the General Assembly, when the president got re-elected just before the corruption scandal, everyone knew that there is something bad in the federation going on. There was only one journalist who came to the General Assembly, and he told me that this assembly looked like the election at the Belarus. But who cares, no one wrote about it, and no one cares, actually. And then also there is a rise of interest when the scores of the Polish athletes on the mega events like Olympic Games are not as good as expected. For example, after Sochi Olympic Games, which were the best Olympic Games, Winter Olympic Games in the Polish history. No one asked any questions. One of the journalists told me, if there is a hot water in the tap, who cares who heated it? So, yeah. So, on the other hand, the journalist told me that the Polish sport federations are passively transparent. I mean, they do not put the information on the websites. You won't see the financial reports. But if you ask questions, they will rather give the information, unless they don't when there is a big corruption scandal. But yeah, usually they do. And the other thing is that the members of the federations, and the federations are associations, they know their rights very well, and they succeeded in building this opinion in Polish society and with Polish journalists that it is not possible to control associations, that they can be funded from public money, but the associations, they are, they self-manage, and you cannot do anything about that. So it's very difficult to control, and journalists usually say, it's very difficult to control, so we will just write about Lewandowski scoring 4 times. And the last comment here is that some of the journalists are very critical about the functioning of particular federations, and when during the interviews, I got a lot of stories about little and bigger corruption affairs, or at least mismanagement. But they said that it's not it's not them who should act. They say there is a sport ministry. They should do something about that. It's obvious that it's going on. So, to summarize, there is a moderate interest of the journalists in sports federation practices, so it's obvious that they are not efficient as a watchdogs, because they don't watch, so if you don't watch, it's useless. And what's worse is that Polish people are not very much involved in public life. We are probably still used to low quality of management in public administration. So people are not very shocked when there is mismanagement or nepotism or corruption, if it's not on a big scale. Little scale corruption, that's how we do. I mean, it's not how we do in business anymore, but that's not our way. We're quite Western country, but still in the sport industry, it is assumed that it is this way. So I think that there should be an extra effort done to change Polish sport. So to just stay with this journalist perspective, I think that the journalist interest in those kind of information should be triggered up somehow. And I think that there could be some things done. One would be the workshops for journalists, just to level up their knowledge about how sport works. How are those organizations financed, and what are the most common challenges about that organizations? And also I think that maybe there should be an institution. I suggested here the Polish Sport Observatory, the institution that would do the everyday regular have this watchdog function and just watch the governance issues and prepare the regular information, constant reports for journalists, so it was easier for them to look at things. That's all. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Yeah, Casper in the back.
Thank you. I was wondering, couldn't it be the case that actually the journalists themselves are corrupted? Did you consider that?
I don't think so, actually. No, those are. Well, I've talked to the, I would say, top sport journalists, and no, I don't think they are corrupted. And I've also asked them whether they are maybe scared to ask questions, and they said, no, it's just, we are not interested. Of course, some of them are. Some people say, I am personally interested in FIFA scandal, and then there are journalists who read a lot and know a lot, but then they say, this is just my personal interest, and we don't write papers about that.
Thank you. You did mention in your presentation that there was some reports of perceived risks and threats, and then you followed up with a comment that may not necessarily be true, and I just wondered if you could comment a little bit more about what sort of expressions of fear you do see and why you think those should be discounted.
It's not my opinion, that's the research. The journalists said, some of the journalists said that they don't want to lose the good contacts, that they don't want to risk asking questions because they might lose contacts. But then the other journalists, some more critical, said that it's not the case. You can ask the questions, and we are quite civilized country after all. And it's, journalists don't get punished. They are not in any way. It's not dangerous to ask questions.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Adurunke Bello from Nigeria. You said something about. I'm interested because I'm a journalist. You mentioned something about corruption-free in journalism in Poland. How is that possible?
Corruption of the journalists?
Yeah, that maybe journalists are free, or I don't know. How is that possible that we have good people?
I didn't. Well, I didn't.
It's not possible that you have 100% good people. Do you know that?
Oh, you're suggesting that some of them are corrupted.
What I'm trying to say, you're coming from there. I'm a journalist, and I've worked with different journalists from all over the world. We've worked together on stories and all that. So, from my own experience, I don't think all journalists cannot be the same. I don't want to believe they receive brown envelopes to write PR stories or not to expose the bad boys. It can't be equal. I'm sorry. I don't believe that. Sorry.
Of course it's not equal. This is, well, is that a methodological question? Because then we can go through the research. I mean, obviously not everyone is the same, and I don't want to state that. I'm just giving the general observation, and then we can talk about the methodology and probably later on. But maybe my last comment would be here that coming back to that broader perspective, I'm from Poland, and Poland is not far from here. It's just Eastern Europe, and it's not a poor country somewhere in the end of the world. And we have this kind of problems that people are not interested. For example, in Poland, I don't remember reading the article about the Qatar situation, and about which we've talked a lot today. That all means that maybe I would suggest that those societies, post-communist societies, they are just not interested enough, and that the Western countries maybe could help with just triggering this interest in general affairs, because the FIFA scandal is just as much our thing as it's your thing, right? But we don't care. Yeah.
Do we have a last question? No?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Urszula. The last speaker is Gigi Alford. She's a special advisor of U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. Fortunately, my presentation will relate to many of the presentations that came before, so I should be able to move through this very quickly and get you all to your coffee break. As Jens said, my name is Gigi Alford, and I'm here wearing two hats. One is a special advisor at the State Department in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And the second is the hat that I'm wearing right now, which is a graduate of the master's program at Oxford University in International Human Rights Law, where I wrote my thesis on the confluence of the FIFA statutes, Swiss private law, and international human rights law. I should remember how to use this. Okay, so my research actually turned up two really interesting unlevel playing fields. The first one is the unfair playing field of the rule of law when it comes to the FIFA statutes. And two was looking at the literal unfair playing field between the artificial turf that the women played on in the World Cup this summer and the natural grass fields that they wanted to play on as elite athletes. So on the audience's left, you should see a tweet from Sydney Leroux, who is a forward for the US soccer team. She is showing off her legs after playing a match on artificial turf. And the tweet says, "This is why soccer should be played on grass." Then on the right, you have one from a fan showing the temperature on the field at the kickoff match during the World Cup. It was 120 degrees Fahrenheit on the field. That's about 50 degrees Celsius. And the opinion of this social media user was the fact that the tournament was being played on turf was stupid. So people have their opinions. This came up in my research when I was looking at the FIFA statutes, and particularly the clause that prohibits political interference and also the one that bans access to ordinary courts of law. As I was doing that research, this case emerged, and it gave me an interesting kind of lens to examine these questions. So this timeline is where I plan to spend most of my time, but since I know we're going to need to adjourn soon, I'll go through it very quickly. But this is essentially to give the sort of play-by-play, to use another sports metaphor, of how the case developed. Okay, so when did the Canadian Soccer Association win the bid to host the Women's World Cup this past summer? That happened in March 2011. So this was quite a while ago. From what I understand, Canada was the only country to bid to host the tournament. So I think that's important to note and something that came up later. So fast forward to September 2014, and we had a comment from the head of women's competition at FIFA, from Tatiana Hayami, who said, "We play on artificial turf and there's no plan B." Why was this a topic of concern? Well, the players, throughout this kind of lapse of time, were raising their concerns and voicing their preference to play on natural grass. They considered artificial turf to be inferior, and they felt like symbolically, and however you want to describe it, this signified a lack of prestige on their part, let alone all of the other concerns that maybe it was less safe, and maybe more dangerous, right? Poor for their health concerns and such. So about a week after we had that comment, more than 60 players from 13 different member associations filed a gender discrimination complaint in the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, alleging all of these concerns. Within the two named respondents were the Canadian Soccer Association and FIFA. Within a week, the CSA filed a response to the tribunal, and they cited the clause within association football to pursue a closed circuit private arbitration. So this means, they had mechanisms within the national associations and then through FIFA and then up to the Court of Arbitration of Sport, where anyone within the football family, a party within the football family, should file their complaint. Very soon afterwards, so you actually had 9 U.S. senators who publicly called for the World Cup, the Women's World Cup, to be played on natural grass. And so you can see that while this legal action was taking place, you also had sort of the public awareness raising and support that was beginning to surface. So on the legal side, because oftentimes when I present this case as just an interesting example of FIFA's statutes, people want to know, what were the legal merits of the case? So quickly to go through that. The judge in the tribunal offered early mediation in place of expedited hearings. So the players said, we're playing in 8 months now. Could you please hold a hearing quickly and make a decision? And so the judge said, you waited very late to file this complaint. We're not going to be able to justify an expedited hearing, but she did offer to do advanced early mediation if the parties would consent. the parties would not consent, but we'll get to that in a second. So soon after this, we still had some pending questions, but the judge said, I'll get back to you. Then we had FIFA's Secretary General, Jérôme Valk, say, if anyone claims that the use of artificial pitch is a question of discrimination, it's nonsense. So those were kind of fighting words in the media. So quickly after that, the judge came back out and said, FIFA still hasn't responded. They were using delay tactics, claiming that they needed to be served a legal notice under the Hague Services Convention, which included not permitting legal notice through email or fax. I guess it had to come by post. So the judge turned around with a decision on that and said that's not the case. So we finally end up with the judge declining. Oh, excuse me. So the important part that happens after this, we had an instance of reprisal threats. So I'm going to read several examples of national associations that came to the applicants named in the complaint and told them the following. So the Mexican Football Federation warned one of their players that FIFA was preparing to suspend her and that she would not be selected to play in the World Cup qualifying games unless she withdrew from legal action. Then you had two players from the French national team who were contacted by their association and persuaded that their participation in the complaint would cost France its bid to host the 2019 Women's World Cup. They removed themselves as well. You had several others who chose not to remove themselves, and so I've excluded those examples except for this. The president of the U.S. Soccer Federation sent an email to the player's lawyer and cited bylaws within the U.S. Soccer Federation, a note from the bylaws on the possible penalties that the players risked if they persisted with the complaint, and this included everything from massive fines to suspension and expulsion. So after losing these 3 players because of their fear of these retributions, 20 additional players signed on to the complaint. So now we have 80 plus applicants named in this proceedings. So at this point, the players alleged that these communications from the member associations amounted to reprisal threats, and they asked for the judge to give an order on a cease and desist order. Well, the judge said, I really shouldn't have to do that because it's in the Human Rights Code of Ontario that you can have access to court without fear of reprisals. So what good would an order from the judge of the court, of the tribunal, do if that's already in the code? So declined that and said, since no one has, or since 2 of the parties have not accepted the early mediation, I'll just continue with our normal time frame for this proceeding. Soon after that, the Golden Ball ceremony happened, and Abby Wambach, the U.S. forward, who's named in the complaint, and also Germany midfielder Nadine Kessler, met with a FIFA delegation, and within a couple weeks, they withdrew their complaint. So one silver lining here is that France did go on to win the bid to host the 2019 Women's World Cup, and that will be held on natural grass. So small comfort there. I thought this was a very compelling quote from Abby Wambach when they dropped the complaint. She says, our legal action has ended, but I am hopeful that the players' willingness to contest the unequal playing fields, the tremendous public support received during the effort, marks the start of even greater activism to ensure fair treatment when it comes to women's sports. So I just wanted to quickly show some of the instruments that are there that validate the women's claim. So we talked about the Ontario Human Rights Code. There are 2 articles in there I wanted to highlight. The first one says every person has a right to equal treatment with respect to services, goods, and facilities without discrimination. So you will see many media articles that say, what are these women talking about? There is no right to play soccer on natural grass. That's not what they were saying. They were saying they have the right to be treated equally as the men. And I don't think I have to convince this room that if the men in the World Cup had said, we don't want to play on artificial turf, that wouldn't happen. But they wouldn't have to say that because it would never have happened in the first place. Then you also have, with respect to the reprisal threats, every person has a right to claim and enforce his or her rights under this act, skip to the bottom, without reprisal or threat of reprisal for doing so.
this is exactly the situation we're talking about. Moving on to some of the international documents that exist, which granted the women the right to claim their access to remedy for this case. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can read it yourself, but it basically says the same thing. You also have, under effect, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You have the American Convention on Human Rights. You have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I'll let you read this yourself, but essentially this is a convention that's dedicated exactly to eliminating discrimination, and so essentially the entire document backs up their claim. And you also have the European Convention on Human Rights because, of course, FIFA is registered in Switzerland, which is a contracting party to the ECHR. So these instruments have normative force, and they also have legal force. However, enforcement is a struggle because it depends on the state application and assurance of that, of those substantive and procedural rights. So just quickly to note the conflict, this is what my last presentation was about earlier this week, and it goes to the question of the rule of law. Within the FIFA statutes, these were some of the provisions that I ended up examining, in particular, those that sort of grant and also operationalize the sports autonomy that FIFA relies on. You have the non-interference clause, which we're most familiar with, and then this mandatory private arbitration clause. So in addition to the one I cite here, instead of recourse to ordinary courts of law, provisions shall be made for arbitration. In addition to that, this obligation is then enforced with threats of penalties, and there is also a requirement from FIFA that the national federations write this mandatory provision into their statutes as well, which is what the Canadian Soccer Association and the US Soccer Federation both made reference to. So these are very real, and they do act in force. So speaking of an unlevel playing field, I just wanted to quickly say, I'll skip through this part, my reflection on where this leaves us. So I just told you a story about how the rules of global football currently impede the fundamental human right of access to justice, which is a very serious thing. You know, in this case, we might be talking about, women players on what was probably very good quality artificial turf, supposedly. So it's maybe a little bit hard to feel sympathy. I know many people think, well, the women's game doesn't make a lot of money, so, that's just too bad for them. Well, they're certainly never going to make a lot of money if they're treated like second-class citizens. So we don't know the ending of this story that I just told. So we have unequal playing fields for women vis-a-vis men. We have unequal playing fields for players vis-a-vis the international sports federations. We're currently writing that next chapter. So what I've heard in this conference over the past several days agrees with what I understand about these principles that we've discussed: sustainability, democracy, and human rights. All of that points to my same conclusion that access to an effective remedy should supersede a sports federation's claim to autonomy or specificity. And like one of the earlier panelists, I really agreed with one of the comments from a speaker last night about this question of sports exceptionalism and what is the cost of this. What I learned from this case in particular was that while international and domestic law might be on the right side of these players, for example, it won't necessarily result in justice. And so while these players had the right to seek redress and remedy in a court of law, they needed a lot more on their side to find vindication. They didn't find it for this particular match, but luckily we know the next Women's World Cup will be played on natural grass, so that's great. But I think, like Abby Wambach said, hopefully this is the beginning of activism for more participation for women in sports. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh.
Yes.
Thank you. Peter Donnelly, Canada. Two things, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Two things that I wanted to mention was that they tore grass out of a couple of those fields in order to put the plastic turf in. So
they did that so that there would be equality among the six pitches.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
yes.
It wasn't rational in any way. A small part of FIFA's slush fund would have been able to put grass in all of those stadiums. But the other side is that during the publicity war that went on around this, one of FIFA's officers who's in charge of playing surfaces or something went on the media and said that there was no difference between the two surfaces in terms of playing, but of course it made sense for Canada to have the plastic turf because it's such a cold country. So I immediately wrote to FIFA and said, so then you'll be putting plastic turf in for 2018 in Russia, right? On those grounds, and they didn't reply for some reason. I'm not sure why. Thank you.
Thanks. And to that point about the slush fund, there's been an interesting comparison between the 30 million budget to produce, the FIFA movie, United Passions, 30 millions to produce that movie, which not very many people saw, versus the, paltry few million that it would have cost to have finished the fields as natural grass. Yeah.
Oh, Jonas?
I think there should have been a viewing of this, public viewing of this movie here and a critical debate afterwards. Could have been a good idea. Just to pose one question in addition, because I found it very interesting as well, and you continued on from some themes that had been addressed throughout the conference. In this specific case, what, from having treated it so specifically and in detail, what you think, do you see any potential opportunities, chances for developments in this current FIFA situation that we see, that there can be changes also to such legal aspects, and how could it be addressed better?
So that's exactly the topic of my paper, so I'll make sure to refer you to that. But very quickly, as an example, in 2004, I believe, the European Union was negotiating the terms of the new player transfer system with FIFA, and specifically requested that the private closed-circuit mandatory arbitration clause be removed as a protection for the individual rights of the players. That was removed. This was following the Bozeman ruling, and so part of legal action that resulted in involvement from a government body. So very interesting that that's what forced the removal there. And then in the same year, FIFA launched the kind of centennial birthday present to itself of a new set of statutes. And it included, lo and behold, the very same private arbitration clauses inserted directly into the statutes. So I think the lesson there is that governments seem to have an important role in playing and protecting individual human rights, but at the same time there needs to be some vigilance because it's playing whack-a-mole if the sports federations can simply remove from the contractual negotiation that's in play and move it to somewhere where it becomes even more entrenched and institutionalized.
Last question? No?
Coffee time.
Then it's coffee time. Thank you very much, everyone.